Today we're going to talk about cell processes. We've talked about cell structures, the functions that those cell structures do, and then now we're going to talk about what those structures work together to do. So we talked about a nucleus is the brain of the cell. It kind of gives commands to the rest of the cell to make stuff, and the cell membrane allows things to pass through it, or it keeps things out, or keeps things in. But now we're going to start kind of getting a little bit more complex, like how do certain organelles work together? How do the cell structures work together to keep the cell alive? So what does the cell do and how, if you want to think about it that way? So here's the standard. You see there's 4 things we're going to focus on. So we've already talked about specifically the nucleus, cytoplasm, We've already talked about, you see that part in parentheses, specifically the cytoplasm, cell membrane, cell walls, chloroplast, lysosome, and mitochondria. Those are the structures we've focused on. Now we're going to continue to construct our explanation using those things to explain how the cell obtains nutrients to grow, how it reproduces, how it makes needed materials, and how it processes waste. And today, specifically, we're going to be looking at the I can statement at the bottom left down there. It says, I can explain the different ways that particles, whether they're really tiny, medium, or large, how they pass through the cell membrane. And each of those sizes, there's other things that affect how they go through the membrane, but we're just going to focus on size. You could talk about polar or non-polar, but because we're just doing a survey, kind of quickly going through this, an overview of it, we're just going to talk about different sizes that go through. Tomorrow we'll talk about mitosis and meiosis, and then the next day we'll talk about cell respiration and photosynthesis, how they get their energy, where they get the energy from. So again, we're focusing on these things. We're going to be also talking about cancer. How does what we apply, how does it have anything to do with cancer? What is cancer? Why are cancer cells bad? Is cancer something that you catch? Is it a disease that you can catch from somebody else? Is it contagious? Why in the world does your body let cancer continue to grow? So we're going to answer some of those questions. A lot of that will be discussed tomorrow, but we'll mention a little bit of that today. So the first section that we're going to go through is going to be getting through the cell membrane. So you can see at the bottom there's kind of 3 sections. That's the one that's in red is today. Tomorrow we'll be talking about cell reproduction. The last day is how cells obtain energy. And these words that are kind of scattered around from the top, cell membrane, exocytosis, endocytosis, all those words are words that we're going to talk about today. And some of these you may have an idea of what they are. So like you already know what cell membrane is. You've heard the words endocytosis and exocytosis. We talked about that a little bit, protein doorway. But a lot of these are going to probably be new to you, and that's fine. You'll get it. So let's talk about passive and active. The word passive, if you've heard of phrases, you may have heard of phrases like passive-aggressive. And that is not somebody that's going to be super angry at you. It's not going to be somebody who is swinging or trying to push. Passive is essentially not using a whole lot of action. So you could see it as kind of an opposite of the word active. And in this case, they are opposites, active transport and passive transport. In this case, passive transport is what happens when no energy is applied. So, for example, if you put a dry paper towel, imagine the paper towel is a cell. If you put a dry cell or a dry paper towel in water, the water is going to go through the membrane of the cell or into the napkin because there's a lot of water on the outside, and it's going to move to where there's not a lot of water. And so if you remember, we talked about with passive transport, when we talked about the cell membrane is a good barrier, but water is so tiny that it can just squeeze through the membrane. The membrane can't really stop it. It can slow it down, but it can't really stop the water from going back and forth. So imagine putting a raisin in water and just letting it soak. Imagine the raisin kind of soaking up water over time. kind of like a cell that is dry will absorb water. It doesn't take energy. It's just because, in the same way, if you pour a cup out, it doesn't take energy for that water to go flat and spread out. If I poured a gallon of milk out on the floor, there's not going to be a big puddle, 3 inches thick in the middle of the room. It's going to spread out pretty evenly. So passive transport is the type of transport that does not require energy. Another example of this is if you think about passing gas. If somebody passes gas, there's going to be a high concentration of the smell near the person that passes gas and a low concentration elsewhere. And slowly what's going to happen is it's going to go from high concentration near that person, low to low concentration away from that person. You can think about the same thing with a bottle of like Lysol or Febreze or something. You spray it in the air, and there's high concentration in the bottle. You open up a little doorway in the bottle, and the smell good fragrance is going to go out. It's going to go away. And it's going to continue to spread out evenly throughout the room. So eventually, if the room's large enough, you're not going to smell it. But what that means is that all those molecules have spread out evenly throughout the room. So that's passive transport. It moves stuff from high concentration to low concentration. If you think about a hill, put a ball at the top part of the hill, the high part of the hill, letting the ball go. If you just set the ball on the ground, it's going to roll down the hill. It's going to go from high to low with no energy. You don't have to kick it or push it or throw it. It's just going to roll on its own. The opposite of that is active transport. And you can see in the pictures, that's when you're pushing molecules into an area where there's already a lot of molecules. You're pushing it from low concentration to high concentration. And just like the word push implies, this takes energy. This requires extra energy. So I use the example of if there's 200 students in my classroom, everybody's standing shoulder to shoulder, stuffy, you can smell body odor, you can smell somebody's passed gas, you can somebody sneeze and it's just gross, like you are ready to get out. There's so many of you in the room. When I open the door, you're going to easily come out. I don't have to convince you to come out. I don't have to beg you or even pull you. You are going to come out of the door on your own. And so that's a type of, that would be like passive transport. It does not require energy on my part to move you out of that room. You're going to want to go. And you're not just going to step outside the door and stay there. You're going to continue moving until you've you've gotten enough room between you and the person next to you. So you're not bumping up against them. You think about the opposite of that. If I opened the door and I needed 5 people to come into the room, 1, I'm going to have to keep you from coming out, and 2, I'm going to have to push them into the room to smush even more. It's going to take a lot of energy to get 4 or 5 of you in there. So that would be like active transport. You can see the pictures. There's 2 videos there: the amoeba review video and the nucleus media explanation. The amoeba is a little bit longer. The nucleus is a YouTube channel. It's pretty short, but I don't feel like it's as good. So you may want to check those out if that's helpful. So diffusion is a type of passive transport. So you may have seen what's called a diffuser. Maybe it's a fragrance, like at the top left up there, a fragrance or a glass jar with some perfume in it with some wooden sticks. The wooden sticks are dry at the top, so when you stick them in the fragrance, it sucks up, it pulls up or wicks up the fragrance, and then it goes into the air pretty quickly because there's low concentration in the air, high concentration in the stick. That's an example of going from high to low concentration, example of passive transport. Or you put over here on the bottom right, spraying something, or on the bottom right, putting food coloring in water. Eventually it's going to spread out and spread out and spread out. So those are examples of things. If an object is tiny and it can go straight through the membrane, like water or oxygen, it's going to move from high to low. We call that moving down the concentration gradient, kind of like you'd be going down a hill. But if the object is too large, it's going to take a good bit of energy from the cell to actually move that object in. And you can see from these GIFs, which I really like the dark blue background ones. You can't see them as well, but they show very well what's going on in the cell membrane. Endocytosis literally means into cell process. It's the process of a large object or a bunch of small objects moving into a cell. So a large particle or a large group of particles can't get into the cell straight through the membrane or through a protein doorway, which is kind of like the medium-sized way of going through. Then it uses endocytosis, goes through this process called endocytosis. The opposite, if there's something in the cell that needs to exit and it's too large, you can see like the GIF there, then it uses exo, as in exit the cell process. It's a process of exiting the cell. So you can go and take notes on that as well. And so here's an example of what I wrote. Here's a couple things you can do. Small things enter the cell. What are some ways that small things enter the cell? And that's what you need to answer there. What are some ways that medium things enter the cell? And you're using vocab. You're using this vocab over here on the right, the red stuff that's on the right. What are ways that things enter the cell? And then medium things enter the cell. And then what are some ways that large things enter the cell, or a large group of things enters a cell? And for each of these, you need to be using the red 1 through 9 over on the side. You're going to be using that. Let me do this. You're going to be using that stuff over to the right, the red over to the right. For the orange box, depending on, these are 3 different assignments. The orange box, to do that, you're going to be making a crossword. You can see it started to do that. It's going to be very easy on a blank sheet of paper. But you take 4 of the words that are on the right over there, 1 through 13. You take 4 of them, and you make a crossword out of them. You see how equilibrium, exocytosis, cell membrane, and endocytosis would have been 4 together. And you're going to write questions. So you just draw this. You don't have to do all the squares. You just draw this and write, 1 across, 1 down, 2 across, 3 down, whatever. And you're going to write questions. And the answer for them are these words. It's like a regular crossword puzzle. Or, to practice this, you can do an acrostic. So right here we've got exocytosis, and for each of the letters there is a phrase that goes along with that word. X is kind of hard, so put Fox's cells must do it, and that is exocytosis. So you're writing phrases here that describe exocytosis. You cannot use the word cell, but you can use any of the other words. Cell is just a little bit too easy. And that's that for today. We will get back, we'll continue on to, like I said, we're going to continue on to the reproduction tomorrow, how cells obtain energy the next day, and then we may have a day of review and then a quiz over all this. If you can honestly say that I can explain the different ways that particles, whether they're tiny, medium, or large, pass through a cell membrane, if you can say that, then you've completed today's objective. You need to show in your reflection for today, you need to show in your reflection that you can actually do that. Give me evidence, show, explain that you can actually do that. Yep, I think that's it. If you have any questions, let me know. And again, we'll start talking about mitosis and meiosis tomorrow.